There is a particular kind of psychological dishonesty that the avoidant practices, not because they are fundamentally deceptive people, but because the architecture of their interior life makes certain truths genuinely inaccessible to conscious acknowledgement. And understanding that distinction is the difference between reading this dynamic accurately and spending years constructing a false narrative about what another person felt and why they behaved the way they did. The avoidant who hurt you did not walk away feeling nothing. That is perhaps the most important and most counterintuitive thing to establish clearly, because the behavioral presentation of avoidant withdrawal is so thoroughly organized around the appearance of comfortable indifference that it produces, in the person on the receiving end of it, the almost inevitable conclusion that the person who left or cooled or withdrew did so with relative ease, that the damage to the connection settled lightly on someone who was already prepared for the exit, that the hurt caused landed somewhere and dissolved quickly, absorbed by the defended interior without leaving significant trace. This conclusion is wrong, is in fact the opposite of what the genuine psychology tends to produce. And the wrongness of it matters because it has been doing specific damage to how the person who was hurt understands their own experience, either inflating the significance of a connection that was genuinely one-sided, or dismissing the significance of a connection that was genuinely mutual but genuinely inadequately expressed. The accurate picture serves neither of those distortions. What the avoidant truly feels after hurting someone they were genuinely connected to is something that mainstream psychological discourse about avoidant attachment rarely examines with sufficient honesty. The discourse tends to stop at the behavioral description. They withdraw, they distance, they cannot tolerate intimacy, without going into the interior experience that the withdrawal is simultaneously expressing and concealing. That interior experience is considerably more turbulent than the behavioral presentation suggests, and considerably more specific in its content than the generic description of avoidant discomfort tends to capture. The first genuine feeling the avoidant has after causing genuine hurt to someone they cared about is not relief, as might be expected, and not guilt in the clean, acknowledging, this is what I did form that genuine accountability produces. It is something more complicated and less comfortable than either of those. It is the specific, disorienting, cannot quite be named experience of having done something that the behavioral logic of the pattern said was necessary, and the interior reality of genuine caring is simultaneously contradicting. The withdrawal made sense to the architecture. The care for the person the architecture was withdrawing from is making the withdrawal's sense feel less certain than the architecture requires it to feel. This internal contradiction is one of the most genuinely uncomfortable interior conditions available to a person whose entire psychological structure was built on the premise that withdrawal is always the safer choice. When the withdrawal produces genuine pain in someone who was genuinely caring, when the architecture's preferred solution creates a problem the architecture was supposed to prevent, the defended interior is confronted with the specific, unwelcome, cannot be efficiently managed evidence that the self-protective logic is producing harm rather than protection. The avoidant will not admit this, not because they are committed to dishonesty, but because admission requires a level of self-implicating honesty that the architecture was specifically constructed to make unavailable. The architecture that prevents genuine intimacy is the same architecture that prevents the genuine acknowledgement of the intimacy's importance, and by extension, the genuine acknowledgement of the significance of having damaged it. The defense that kept the empath at arm's length is the same defense that keeps the honest reckoning with the hurt caused at arm's length. Both feel, from the inside, like wisdom. Both are, from the outside, the same defended system doing the only thing it knows how to do. What the avoidant feels but will not admit is something close to the following, translated from the interior's nonverbal, pre-linguistic register into language that can be examined honestly. They feel the specific weight of genuine loss differently than they expected to feel it. The self-sufficiency narrative was supposed to make the distance comfortable, was supposed to restore the conditions that preceded the connection, The manageable, not pressing against anything important, adequately handled conditions of the defended life before genuine attachment complicated things. The self sufficiency narrative is not delivering on that promise in the way it has historically delivered, and the specific quality of its failure reveals what it was always concealing: that the connection was more significant than the architecture was willing to acknowledge while it was present. This is the genuinely controversial thing that needs to be said plainly rather than softened into something more comfortable. The avoidance difficulty in admitting what they feel after hurting someone is not primarily a communication problem. Is not the product of emotional immaturity in the simple sense of someone who has not learned the right relational vocabulary. It is the product of a defensive system that is genuinely, structurally, at the level of the nervous system and the implicit memory and the precognitive operating assumptions, organized around preventing the acknowledgement of the very things that genuine accountability would require acknowledging. Which means that waiting for the avoidant to admit what they truly feel is, in many cases, waiting for the defense system to voluntarily dismantle the protection it was built to provide. That does not happen because the other person waits patiently. It does not happen because the person communicates clearly what they need from the avoidant in terms of acknowledgement. It does not happen because the connection was real enough, or the hurt significant enough, or the empath extraordinary enough to constitute the specific catalyst that produces the admission. It happens when it happens because the avoidant arrives through their own interior process, on their own timeline, through the specific combination of accumulated cost and genuine exhaustion of the management's alternatives, at the point where the cost of not acknowledging exceeds the cost of acknowledging, where the interior reality of what they feel can no longer be maintained at functional distance from the behavioral reality of how they are living, where the gap between the genuine feeling and the managed presentation has become too energetically expensive to sustain. What the avoidant genuinely feels in the period following genuine hurt caused to someone they genuinely cared about tends to unfold in layers that do not arrive simultaneously and do not follow a predictable sequence. Understanding the layers honestly is different from the simplified account of avoidant guilt that circulates in popular discourse about attachment psychology. The first layer is the one closest to the surface, and therefore the most readily accessible to the avoidant's conscious awareness, however much the management works to interpret it in less implicating terms. It is the specific, directional, this particular person missing that has been examined throughout this conversation, not the generic discomfort of someone who has lost pleasant company. The precise, named, cannot be substituted with anything generically available sense of absence that is the signature of genuine attachment having been formed. The avoidant misses the specific quality of the person's presence, the particular texture of what it felt like to be in contact with someone who was simply, genuinely, completely themselves, in a way that resists the management's attempts to reframe it as the ordinary social discomfort of any significant connections ending. The second layer arrives later and is more uncomfortable than the first. It is the dawning, resistant, not yet fully conscious recognition that the hurt was not an unfortunate accident of incompatibility, but the direct consequence of specific behavioral choices. The withdrawal was a choice. The indirect communication was a choice. The management of the connection's depth was a choice. The insufficient showing up across the ordinary days was a series of choices. None of these choices were made with full conscious awareness of their cost to the other person. The architecture was preventing that full awareness. But the choices were made nonetheless, and the avoidant who is genuinely honest with themselves in the quieter hours arrives eventually at the recognition that the hurt was produced by their own behavior, rather than by circumstances or timing or the inevitable friction of two people who are not quite right for each other. The third layer is the most deeply defended, and therefore the most rarely acknowledged, even in the interior, let alone in any external expression. It is the recognition of what the connection actually was, what the empath actually represented in the avoidance interior, what quality of genuine contact was present in the specific moments when the management relaxed and something real passed between them. combined with the honest assessment of what the avoidance behavioral pattern did with that quality of genuine contact, which was not receive it adequately, not match it, not honor it with the consistent, present, ordinary days showing up that genuine care for another person produces when it has access to adequate behavioral expression. The avoidant who arrives at the third layer without the management redirecting them into something more comfortable is in the most genuine and most painful contact with the honest truth of what occurred, is sitting with the recognition that something categorically different from what the defended life ordinarily provides was genuinely present and was genuinely not honored by the behavior that the architecture produced. This recognition has a specific quality in the avoidance interior that distinguishes it from ordinary regret and from the surface level remorse of the regret phase. It does not feel like missing out on something pleasant. It feels like having been given access to something real and having allowed the architecture to determine the response to it, rather than allowing the genuine self to determine the response. It feels like the specific, self-implicating recognition of having prioritized the management's comfort over the genuine care that the connection warranted. That feeling is not guilt in the ordinary sense. It's more structural than that. It's the honest encountering of the gap between who the avoidant was in the connection and who the genuine care for the person would have required them to be. And that gap is not a comfortable thing to encounter, which is why the architecture works so efficiently to prevent the encounter from occurring fully. The person who was hurt deserves to know all of this, not as the consolation of being told that the avoidant secretly feels terrible about what they did. That framing serves neither honest understanding nor genuine healing. They deserve to know it because accurate understanding of what actually occurred, including the accurate account of what was genuinely present in the avoidance interior, alongside the accurate account of what the behavior produced, is the only foundation on which genuine closure, genuine forward motion, or genuine assessment of any possible return can be honestly built. The accurate account is this: the avoidant felt something genuinely real in the connection. The genuine feeling was met with the architecture's characteristic response, which was the insufficient behavioral expression that has been the subject of this entire conversation. The hurt was caused by the gap between the genuine feeling and the inadequate expression. The avoidant, after the hurt was caused, entered the interior territory described above, the layered, not fully conscious, management-resisted recognition of what the genuine feeling was and what the behavior failed to honor about it. Whether that interior territory eventually produced genuine reckoning or was efficiently managed into something the defended life could accommodate without fundamental revision is the variable that determines everything about what follows. And the person's life, the genuine, ordinary, fully inhabited life that has been the honest destination of this entire conversation, continues, regardless of which of those outcomes the avoidance interior produces. The accuracy of the understanding serves the person. The outcome of the avoidance interior process serves the avoidant. Both are real. Neither determines the other. And the most important of the two, for the person who was hurt and who is genuinely moving through the honest work of reclamation, is genuinely and always the same one: their own life, their own ordinary days, their own genuine, complete, forward-moving inhabitation of what is actually here, right now, which has always been and remains the whole of the thing. The layers described in the previous section deserve honest extension rather than simple amplification. What avoidants truly feel after hurting someone is not a subject that benefits from increasingly elevated language or the continued escalation of psychological drama. It benefits from genuine precision about what is actually happening in a real human interior, which is considerably messier and less cinematically coherent than the language of depth psychology tends to represent it. So the honest extension begins here, with the acknowledgement that the avoidance interior, after causing genuine hurt, is not organized around the hurt the way the person who received the hurt is organized around it. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the asymmetry of the aftermath, And it is the thing that produces the most confusion and the most misreading of whatever signals emerge from the avoidant in the period following the damage. The person who was hurt tends to process the hurt as the central event. The connection, the damage to it, the specific behavioral choices that produced the damage, the question of what it means and what comes next, these occupy a significant portion of the interior's active attention. The hurt is present, is processed, however imperfectly, as the primary material the interior is currently working with. The avoidance interior is not organized around the hurt in the same way, not because the hurt is less significant to them. The genuine connection was real, and its damage is genuinely felt, but because the avoidance interior is organized above all around the management of the avoidant's own interior states. The hurt caused to the other person is present as one of those interior states, as the guilt, the recognition, the specific discomfort of having caused something that the genuine caring did not intend to produce. But it is present alongside all the other interior states that the management is simultaneously running protocols on. The fear that the closeness was producing, the relief that the distance has reduced the pressure, the specific, low-level, harder-to-name discomfort of the self-sufficiency narrative not delivering its promised comfort. All of it running simultaneously, none of it being given the primary organizational position in the interior that the hurt person would expect the guilt to occupy. This is why the avoidance behavior in the aftermath of causing hurt tends to be so baffling to the person on the receiving end of it. The person expects the guilt to organize the avoidance behavior around some form of acknowledgement, repair, or at minimum, the visible evidence of genuine struggle with what was caused. What they tend to observe instead is behavior that appears to have moved on, that appears to be organized around the ordinary conditions of the avoidance life, rather than around the significant event of having genuinely hurt someone who genuinely cared about them. The appearance of having moved on is the management doing its job, is the organized, efficient. This is what the defense does with uncomfortable interior content processing of the hurt caused into the background of the defended life's ongoing operation, rather than the foreground of a reckoning that the defense was built to prevent from occupying the foreground. But underneath the managed appearance of having moved on, the guilt is present, is doing its slower, less efficiently managed work in the interior spaces where the defense is less vigilant, in the early hours before the day's management protocols are fully operational, in the specific unguarded moments when the person being missed surfaces without permission and is followed, however briefly, by the recognition that the missing has the specific quality of something that was genuinely cared about and genuinely not honored by the behavior that the architecture produced. The guilt that the avoidant carries after causing genuine hurt is worth examining with genuine precision, because the popular discourse about avoidant guilt tends to either dramatically overstate it, the avoidant secretly consumed by remorse, counting the days until they can honestly confess the depth of their feeling, or dismissively understate it, the avoidant essentially incapable of the genuine self-reflection that real guilt requires, simply moving through successive connections without genuine accumulation of moral weight from the damage left behind. Neither extreme is accurate, and the inaccuracy of both extremes produces real consequences for the person trying to understand what actually happened and make genuine decisions from that understanding. The genuine account is more textured than either extreme. The avoidant does carry something that functions as guilt, in that it is the specific, self-implicating, uncomfortable recognition that their own behavioral choices produced genuine harm to another person. This is real, and it persists in the interior in the way that genuine moral weight tends to persist, not as the acute, front-of-consciousness distress of someone who is actively processing it, but as the background, low-level, requires occasional management presence of something that has not been adequately resolved. What makes the avoidance version of guilt different from the guilt that secure attachment tends to produce is not its absence or its superficiality. It is the specific relationship between the guilt and the management's protocols. In someone with secure attachment, Guilt tends to produce the impulse toward repair, toward the direct, honest, accountable engagement with what was caused and what the person who was harmed deserves in response. The guilt and the repair impulse are connected by the basic assumption that genuine accountability is not only the right response to having caused harm, but a survivable one. That being honestly responsible for something does not constitute the catastrophic self exposure that the avoidance architecture treats it as. In the avoidant, the guilt and the repair impulse are severed by that specific architectural feature. The guilt is genuinely present. The repair impulse, to the extent it exists, is intercepted by the management before it can organize itself into the direct, accountable, self-implicating behavior that genuine repair would require. What emerges instead is the softer, more indirect, less exposing version of the repair impulse. The tentative reaching out that does not directly address what it is reaching out about. The peripheral engagement that maintains some connection to the orbit of the person hurt without the direct engagement that genuine accountability would demand. The "I've been thinking about you" that is true in its content and incomplete in its honesty. There is something deeply uncomfortable that deserves to be said plainly here, even though it contradicts the more sympathetic framing that much of this conversation has applied to the avoidant psychology. The avoidant's inability to directly acknowledge what they caused is not simply the tragic limitation of a wounded system doing its best within its constraints. It is also, in a genuine and practically significant sense, a choice. Not a fully conscious choice, made with complete awareness of its implications and its costs to the other person, but not purely mechanical either, not purely the automatic operation of a system that is running without the possibility of intervention. The avoidant has access to some degree of metacognitive awareness about their own patterns, has some capacity, in the quieter hours, to recognize what the management is doing and why, has some ability to feel the gap between the genuine feeling and the inadequate expression, and to understand, however partially, that the gap is producing consequences for another person. That metacognitive access, however limited, however partial, however imperfectly connected to the behavioral system, means that the continued operation of the management in the face of genuine guilt is not purely involuntary. It is the choosing, however unconscious and however fear-driven, of the management's comfort over the repair that the guilt was pointing toward. Is the ongoing, daily accumulated non-choosing of the vulnerability that genuine acknowledgement would require. Is the specific, sustained refusal, not always deliberate but not purely accidental either, to let the interior reality of guilt and caring and genuine missing become the behavior of honest accountability that those interior realities were always warranting. This is the thing that the avoidant will genuinely never admit. Not the guilt itself. Some avoidants, in the right conditions, with the right support, can arrive at the honest acknowledgement of having felt genuine remorse. But the choosing, the specific, ongoing, accumulated non-choosing of the harder but more honest path. The recognition that the management was not an external constraint acting on them, but a system they were, at some level, cooperating with. Because the alternative, genuine vulnerability, genuine accountability, genuine exposure of the caring and the failing, was genuinely frightening in a way they were not willing to face. The admission of the choosing would require the avoidant to take a form of responsibility for the pattern that the pattern's own framing as protective necessity was always preventing. The pattern says, I do this because I cannot help it, because the fear is genuine, because the architecture was built in conditions that did not give me better options. The admission of the choosing would have to say something more uncomfortable. I do this because I keep choosing the familiar discomfort of managed distance over the frightening discomfort of genuine exposure. And that choosing, however fear-driven, has consequences for real people that I have been allowing the architecture to obscure from my honest accounting. The person who was hurt by the avoidant and is reading this deserves the honest accounting of what that means for them, not the consolation version, the actually true version. It means the avoidance behavior was not purely the impersonal operation of a system they had no relationship to, had some element of the ongoing non choosing of what the genuine caring for the person would have required, was, in the most honest account, a pattern that continued because the avoidant was not yet willing to face what stopping it would cost them in terms of genuine exposure and genuine vulnerability. That is painful to receive. It's also significantly more honest than the framing that converts the avoidant entirely into the passive victim of their own architecture, with no meaningful role in the perpetuation of the behavior that caused the hurt. The honest account holds both. The architecture is real, and its constraints are real, and the fear that built it was genuinely produced by genuine early experience, and is not simply weakness or selfishness in the ordinary sense. And the ongoing operation of the architecture in the face of genuine caring for another person and genuine recognition of the hurt being caused was also, at some level, the continued non choosing of the more honest alternative. Both true, neither canceling the other. The structural explanation is accurate. The personal responsibility is also real. Holding both is the complete picture. What the avoidant also truly feels, but will not admit, is something that tends to get categorized as the simple emotion of sadness, but is actually more specific and more structurally significant than that word tends to convey. It is the specific, interior, not fully conscious recognition of having been someone who loved genuinely and behaved insufficiently, of having had the experience of genuine connection, the real thing, the categorically different quality of being in contact with someone who was completely authentically themselves, and having allowed the architecture to determine the response to that experience rather than allowing the genuine self to determine it. This recognition has a specific quality of grief about the self that is different from ordinary guilt. Ordinary guilt is organized around what was done to someone else. This interior grief is organized around what the avoidant did to themselves, to their own capacity for genuine love's expression, to their own ability to receive and honor something that the defended interior was always, at some level, genuinely wanting. The avoidant who has been in genuine contact with someone whose authentic presence reached them is a person who had access, however briefly and however imperfectly, to a different way of being in relationship than the defended life typically provides. And the distance they created from that access, whatever its architectural causes, whatever fear drove the management's response, was also the forfeiting of something they genuinely wanted. The defended life protects the avoidant from the risk of genuine intimacy. It also costs them the experience of genuine intimacy. And in the interior, in the quiet hours, in the spaces where the management is less efficient, the avoidant who truly cared about the person they hurt is feeling both the protection and the cost, with a clarity that the self-sufficiency narrative is working to obscure. The specific, genuinely controversial thing worth saying here is that the avoidant's interior suffering after causing genuine hurt is real, and it is also, in a meaningful sense, appropriate. Not as punishment, not as the deserved consequence of moral failure, but as the natural, honest, psychologically appropriate response to the gap between genuine caring and insufficient expression. The discomfort is the interior's honest signal that something significant occurred and was not handled adequately. The management working to reduce that discomfort to something more tolerable is not serving the avoidant's genuine well-being, is serving the architecture's comfort. Those are not the same thing, and the conflation of them is one of the more consequential errors that the defended life perpetually makes. The avoidant who allows the discomfort to be what it is, who engages with it honestly rather than efficiently managing it into the background of the defended life, is the avoidant who has the most genuine access to the possibility of something different. Not because the discomfort is productive in itself, because the honest engagement with discomfort is the precondition for genuine change, and genuine change is the only thing that addresses the pattern at the level at which it actually operates. The person who was hurt, having read all of this, deserves the most honest possible statement of what it means for them and what it does not mean. It means the avoidance feeling was genuine. The interior caring was real. The hurt caused was not the result of a person who was indifferent to them, but of a person whose genuine caring was operating inside an architecture that consistently prevented its adequate expression. It does not mean the person should wait. Does not mean the genuine interior feeling constitutes a debt that the avoidant owes, payable in the form of eventual adequate showing up. Does not mean the real caring translates into anything the person can rely on or build from, unless and until the avoidant does the specific, sustained, internally motivated work of changing the architecture that prevented the caring from finding adequate expression. It means the connection was real, which the person may have needed confirmed, and which the honest examination of what the avoidant truly feels, however they never admit it, genuinely confirms. It does not mean the person's life should remain organized around the question of what the avoidant does with the genuine feeling they will never admit. The person's life is genuinely, completely, without condition, theirs, in the ordinary days, which have always been the whole of the thing. The avoidant feels what they feel and holds it in the interior and manages it to whatever degree the architecture permits, and occasionally allows it to surface in the imperfect, indirect, not as honest as it deserves to be forms that the management makes available. The person lives their life, completely, right now, both true, both real. Only one of them is the person's primary concern, and it has always been and will always be the second one.